everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Todd Harrison. I'm a senior fellow in the Foreign and Defense Policy program here at AEI. And I'm honored to have with us as a guest today for our discussion the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Russell Rumbaugh, Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Financial Management and Comptroller, otherwise known as the Navy Comptroller. Known Russ for a very long time, been friends and colleagues for many years. He's worked in a variety of positions, both in DoD and on the Hill, and in think tanks, actually. And he most recently came into the Department of the Navy from the Aerospace Corporation. He'd previously worked at the Stimson Center, another think tank here in D.C., worked at the Congressional Research Service for many years. And he actually began his career as a U.S. Army infantry officer. You don't talk about that with the Navy folks. Yeah. Maybe I'll ask you a few things about the Army budget and how much money the Navy took from them this year. But it's a pleasure to have Russ here for this discussion. We will also be taking questions from the audience, both in the room and online. So when we turn to that, if you're online, you can go ahead and start emailing in questions. I think there's a link on the site where you can send them in by email, and then I get to read them off an iPad up here, and then we'll open it up for questions in the room as well later on. Let's jump right into it, and I'll start grilling you, all right? This was obviously a more difficult than usual budget year, preparing the FY25 budget request. Not only did you have to prepare it not knowing what FY24 would be, because Congress was pretty late appropriating, you also had to reduce how much you were putting in the budget. Overall for DoD, it's $10 billion less than was previously planned for FY25, and that's because of the budget caps in effect. But the Navy actually seemed to fare pretty well. Within the Department of the Navy service was up slightly relative to last year's projection for FY25. The Marine Corps was down slightly, but you did a lot better than, say, the Army, which was losing ground in the budget. So my question for you is, why did the Navy do so well relative to the other services, and what does this mean in terms of DoD's priorities and how the Navy fits into those priorities?
Such a great question, although I should have interrupted you to do my own, thanks to you and AEI for having me. I was a little bit nervous. Todd has known me for a long time, and I was worried how he was going to describe the bio. I was worried there might be some judgment on various phases of, like, this is when he didn't actually produce good analysis, and I'm a little embarrassed to have known him. So I'm glad to have skipped past that. It's a great question, and I think a great story about where the nation is. We are at a time where we're aware we're a maritime power, where we know the pacing challenge is China, and what you are seeing is actual strategic choices. Todd and I have come up as budgeteers, and our standard thing we do is say, hey, you've got these strategic words, but then when we go find the numbers, it's not supported. And the easiest way you could always hoist somebody is be like, the service share stayed the same. To invoke my old boss, he would say, hot war, no war, cold war. Why is there no change to that? What you're seeing is a change to that, and I don't think it should surprise anybody. Todd's trying to bait me into cracks at the Army's expense, but I don't think that it's not that the Army isn't an important part of what brings to the nation. It's that what we need more of are nuclear deterrent submarines, fast attack submarines, destroyers that are sailing in the Red Sea, a Marine Corps that can respond to a crisis like Gaza and be there immediately, a Marine Corps that is already positioned in the first island chain with their new force design. When you run down that, you see how many of the efforts the country needs are in the Department of the Navy, and I think that's reflected in the budget. I think that's a huge credit to everybody up and down the line in the executive branch and in the legislative branch for recognizing that fundamental difference.
Well, you mentioned the Red Sea, so let's go right into some tactical things that are going on now. The Navy has obviously been doing a lot of work in the Red Sea defending against Houthi missiles. Using up a lot of interceptors in the process. I don't think we know publicly the exact numbers or anything yet. What is the Navy going to need in terms of replenishing its stocks because of these operations in the Red Sea, and should we expect to see that in a supplemental request sometime in the next year?
Sometime in the next year? How about right now? It's not that we're publicly keeping the munitions from anybody, it's just I have to wake up and check, did they actually shoot anything last night? Because the number keeps changing, and we are using expensive solid rocket motor missiles, standard missiles, Tomahawks. Those things are pricey. First thing you have to do is say, well, would you rather expend them or would you rather have the bad guy stuff land? Obviously, we need to come up with new answers. The Secretary of the Navy has already been down to Dahlgren to look at other answers, but having those ships and those sailors in harm's way, knocking things down, sorry, I'll have to put up one of the Navy cliches, the global economy floats on seawater. To your point, the budget tactic of we are waiting on the FY24 supplemental right now. Very much appreciate congressional action on the base 24 appropriations. You saw that the Navy got a 5.4% increase over not just over our base last year. So from base to base, a 5.4% increase. That at a time when CPI is 3.2%. So we are getting the 2 to 3% real growth that Secretary Gates called for. I think you and I can agree he kind of made that number up. But nevertheless, it's a pretty good metric to use of you're getting real growth. We're going to lose some of that real growth if we have to replenish those stocks. The standard missiles and Tomahawks that are built in Aberdeen, South Dakota, if we have to replenish those from within our own, instead of Congress recognizing that this is an extreme situation and giving us those money. The 155 shells that are built in Garland, Texas, that are built in Scranton, Pennsylvania, money is in the Senate passed supplemental to replenish those stocks, make the Department of the Navy whole, even as we face challenges around. So yeah, I think we're in a world, you and I have grown up in a world where supplementals have been a regular thing. That supplemental is on the Hill right now, awaiting action. That is the first and most important answer to the question.
So you're saying you need the FY24 supplemental first, then you can come back and you can start thinking about what do we need in a 25 supplemental? Is that the game plan?
Is there a 25 supplemental? No, we're not in 25 yet. But we do. Are the level of operations going to continue? We know there can be. The conversation about how to do that, we'll look at that, especially with 25 being a capped year by the Fiscal Responsibility Act. If we do have these elevated global responses, we have to be open to that. For now, and I feel a little sorry for my colleagues over on the appropriations staff, right? Same joke I started with. What do we need? Well, what happened last night? So it's constantly updating how big the demand is, and it's something we'll just have to watch.
Let's talk a little more about some of the specific choices that were made in the FY25 request. So while the Navy was somewhat shielded from cuts, it's not entirely shielded. There were some programs that took a reduction relative to what had been previously planned. So one that jumped out to me in particular was a Virginia-class attack sub. Instead of buying 2 in FY25, the plan now is to only buy 1. You know that there is a long tradition in Washington of using what's called the Washington Monument strategy, where you cut something you know is going to be terrible in the eyes of Congress. They will be forced to put the money back, but then they have to figure out how to pay for it. Was cutting the Virginia-class sub, is that Washington Monument strategy, or are there real serious justifications about why you needed to cut that sub this year?
You couldn't ask the question better. No. This is a real decision. A real decision you can see proven out with the CNO's unfunded priority list having come out, and there's no submarine on it. This is not trying to slip the caps, play a game at the budget level. This is the Navy and the Department of Defense recognizing a fundamental reality. We have bought 2 Virginia-class submarines every year since 2011. For those who pay really close attention, they might notice that there's been a couple of years the Navy did not actually propose to, thus Todd's question. But nevertheless, we have always had to. That is not what we're hoping to have happen this year. 16 boats already appropriated, 14 already on contract, tens of billions of dollars of backlog at the yards. And even greater demand coming as we move into full rate production for Columbia, as we work with the Australians to make AUKUS a reality. There is just a fundamental tension and difficulty there that we, with our industrial partners, with our partners in Congress, need to work through. On basically every other question you ask me about 25, I'm going to say, oh, hard choices. Fiscal Responsibility Act, we've got to prioritize. That's not true on the Virginia class. It's a different dynamic where we are looking at this backlog, and just throwing more money at the backlog is not going to produce outcomes. To outpace China, we have to get those subs out of the yards and to sea. We believe the best way to do that is to create this break to allow some of that to go through. Keep in mind, it's not that we're spending less money on submarines. $3.9 billion in FY25 for the submarine industrial base. $11.1 billion over the fit-up. We left the advanced procurement for the second boat in to make sure we could grease the system as much as possible. So we are, instead of putting money to a sub, are putting money directly to the yards. This is not a walking away from our industrial partners. This is not walking away from our undersea dominance. It is to try to get better outcomes. Oh, by the way, did I mention in FY24 supplemental? $3.3 billion. So almost $15 billion over a 6-year period. We get no grief from Congress. Everybody recognizes the value of making these direct investments to try to do better and to get to better outcomes. It is not a Washington monument ploy. It is a necessary moment that we, with our congressional industrial partners, need to push through to actually get strategic outcomes.
Well, so a report came out this week, the Navy's own report, looking at all of the delays in the shipyards. And it's not just a Virginia-class program. I mean, it's kind of down the line. There are these backlogs, and it's taking longer and longer for ships to come out. You know, what is it now, 5-6 years on a Virginia-class sub? And getting longer. What is the fundamental problem, and what do you need from Congress in order to help fix that problem?
Let's not just put the onus on Congress. So, you know, what is the fundamental problem? I don't think it's anything that's going to surprise anybody, right? It's all the stuff everybody can see. It's workforce challenges, supply chain challenges. It's making sure we have the right information at the right time to make good decisions within the building, with industry, with Congress. So there's not some magic. What do we need to do? The same thing I just talked about. We know, we, the Department of the Navy, are part of this. We are getting support all the way through the US government for that. That's why you see these incredibly large sums of investment. On workforce, we asked for $450 million for workforce training in the DoD-wide IBAS account. Congress added extra money, right? Saw that money and added it. So we know we have to make investments to achieve these outcomes. At the same time, my secretary has been very clear, we need our industrial partners to help. We can't just be putting more dollars on the backlog, reinsuring investors that these are going concerns. We need to turn this into outcomes where ships and subs roll off the line. The 45-day review Todd referred to just came out last night. That absolutely happened when the secretary realized that there were a number of programs that were not meeting their standards, and so he set that to do a comprehensive look. We have now come clean and said hey, this is where these programs are. We still need to work through the hardcore nitty-gritty of like, what do we actually do to fix that? Because like I said, it's easy to see where the problems are. How do you solve the problems is a difficult question.
Well, so related to that, building on it, AUKUS, the agreement between the US, UK, and the Australians to get nuclear-powered attack subs to Australia, you know, very important strategically to balance China. But does that just further complicate and add to the challenges in our shipbuilding industrial base?
I don't think so. I think you started with the right thing. Like, this is the great strategic moment, right? Let's get our allies and partners with the best thing there is out there. The Virginia-class sub runs laps around everything else in the water. That's great. Let's get our allies and partners who we can trust with that kind of technology, who will go through the rigor of being able to take care of that kind of technology. And that's what's happening right now. You already have Australians working with the Navy, in the Navy, to learn that so they can go back and do it. Does that increase the challenge in the out years? Yes. The sheer amount of tonnage of submarines we want to pour out of that yards is unparalleled. They're just bigger. Even than the truly national moments like World War II, our tonnage is just very, very high. That is far enough down the line that it is something we need to get through and be there. That is why we're making the investments now, why we're dealing with the delays now, to make sure those lines are running smooth by the time we actually get to the moment when it's needed, when the Australians take their boats, when we really want the Columbia class coming out every year to get that new generational nuclear deterrent to sea.
All right. I want to turn to something now that's more of a fun question. Fun for me. It may not be fun for you.
For me too, because who doesn't like budget questions?
So
whether the rest of you will think a budget question is fun is the harder one.
Well, this is stuff with fun names in it. So there are a number of classified funding lines in the Navy budget. I love to track these. You used to track them as well, with very interesting names. It is notable to me, though, that the two largest program elements in the Navy's research and development budget are called Link Tangerine and Pilot Fish, and you look at the description of them, it just says it's classified. But they aren't the only ones. You go down the list, there's Retract Maple, Link Evergreen, Chalk Coral, Link Plumeria, Retract Juniper, Chalk Eagle, I could go on. Lots of fun code names in there. So two questions, what's up with the weird names? And two, what should we read into the fact that so much of the Navy's R&D budget is going into these classified funding lines?
I think you already answered the first question, didn't you? You said fun, cool, like who doesn't want some great code names? On the second one, I'm not sure I would use this phrase "so much is going in." We absolutely exploit every advantage we can to provide maritime dominance against any potential adversary. Some of those things achieve their best value if nobody knows about them. So we're not going to talk about them today because we're going to keep that advantage for real. There is a bunch of stuff. We have a lot of stuff that's sitting in between where we're kind of talking about it, right? Disruptive Capabilities Office that is coming out of Task Force 59 that's really trying to leverage Uncrewed, right? To really get into the future. We are, not to steal a beat, but we are glad to be a part of the Deputy Secretary's Replicator program. And this is absolutely something where we're talking about Replicator. We can talk about autonomous, we can talk about attritable, but am I going to tell you what our specific programs are? No, because now I'm telling you what attritable and autonomous things we're pursuing. But I assure you, the Deputy herself has said that there's about $500 million in 24, which the appropriations bill moved fast. When you have a good story to tell, everybody, we can get into process at some point. What people fail to recognize is the process moves slow when not everybody agrees with you. When everybody's like, yeah, that's a good idea, I can move through a process with no problem, go lay the case out to the appropriators with the appropriate classifications, and make sure that comes out in a 24 budget, even if it's 6 months late, right? So that's taking advantage of something late. There are definitely maritime programs. We think they're very proud. The Navy would have backed those programs anyway, and they sit there at that edge of, can't talk about some of it, but super excited to be pursuing them as well.
So in terms of Replicator, are there things in the 25 budget request that are being funded because of the Replicator initiative? You said there's money in 24, but what's in the 25 request?
There is stuff in the 25 request. You asked the question in a great way, but we have to parse that a little bit. The department has been very cautious not to turn Replicator into just a pool of money that people get to go and take. From my perspective, that's a good idea. Makes it harder to answer questions like this, right? It's very nice if there's just a pot of money. Todd and I can tell you the budgeteering of, here's your line, that's how much you spend. The problem with that is that then gets filled with a bunch of programs that everybody's glad to take the money, but it's not clear you've gotten any buy-in from from the people who need to field it, use it, employ it. By accepting a little ambiguity, you do get buy-in. The Navy identifies a program, hey, you know, we're pretty serious about this. What do you think about it? Yes, we want to emphasize that, and I do think there are a couple cases where the Navy's looking at something, they're curious about it, and that leadership attention ratchets it up. One of the things you'll see in the coming year is the Navy internalizing that. They are not just responding to the Deputy Secretary, we're responding to our new Chief of Naval Operations, our Secretary's guidance, and so you're seeing parallel efforts as we face the pacing challenge we all need to.
All right. I do want to see if there are questions here in the audience. So if you've got a question, you can raise your hand. I see one in the back over here. If we can get a microphone. All right. And anyone who has questions online, please email them in, and we'll be checking up here. Go ahead.
Hi. Thank you for coming. This is a great discussion. My question specifically is about not only the delays that came out last night, but also regarding the long-range shipbuilding plan that came about a week or two ago. Are those delays reflected in the long-range shipbuilding plan, or will they have to be reflected in the future based on the news that came out last night? Thank you very much.
It's a great question, and no, the shipbuilding review is a new development. The shipbuilding plan, now some of that will get out in the wash because of when the shipbuilding review does the tick marks for each ship about when we're buying it, right? So some of the buying will continue on even as we try to compress the execution. On several of them, for instance, the frigate, the way we rolled it out last night was up to 36 months delay. Hey, we're not willing to concede that yet. We're certainly not willing to concede the entire delay on Columbia. We need to look at ways at clawing that back, about getting more efficient. So we're trying to be honest and transparent with Congress, with the American people, but we're going to fight to bring that back in. Again, what steps do we take to materially improve outcomes and bring that back? You won't be surprised here, that's a little bit of a tense conversation as we need to start pointing fingers and say, we need to do this, we need your help doing that, we need to talk better at this point. And that's going to be a powerful and important conversation.
I want to ask a related question here, and I always get asked by folks, you know, what are the must-fund things in the budget? What are like the crown jewels? So I want to ask you, in the Navy's budget, you mentioned, you know, Columbia-class program, you know, having delays, but is that one of the crown jewels that you just can't do without? And are there other things in the Navy budget that no matter what, no matter how much the budget might be cut, you just can't do without?
That's a great question, Todd. It gets a little bit into the philosophy of budget. How much are you like, do you want me to live off of $50 million instead of a $250 billion budget? I think we should talk about the U.S. being the greatest nation on earth and continuing it with the right investments in the Department of the Navy. But to more seriously take its place, Columbia would definitely be one of those, right? Columbia, whatever delay it's suffering is not coming from a funding problem. And that was true with our congressional overseers as well, right? The only anomaly, an anomaly being, hey, we're just going to give you a continuing resolution. We lived under 4 for 6 months. We are now up to, in the last 20 years, cumulative 5 years of living under continuing resolutions. That does not help us achieve good outcomes. Nevertheless, everybody, including Congress, knew how important that Columbia was. And so in 24, the tick mark for the second boat, the Wisconsin, goes in, and we got an anomaly to start that, a new start of the second boat. So that level is the highest. The second one is taking care of our sailors and Marines. The SecDef is very clear about this, taking care of people, and we just lived through this. In the NDAA, we got a 5.2% pay raise for both civilians and military. That starts in the new year, the new calendar year, January. Well, I'm still living off a CR from FY23 that did not have that pay raise in there. We immediately start paying people the pay raise. We absolutely need to take care of our people. I was pretty nervous because if we get stuck at a CR level, we have to find that money somewhere else. Choices have to be made. Congress came through. They acknowledged the 5.2 pay raise. We still actually do have a little bit of difficulty with Marine Corps military personnel. The Marines, the only ones meeting their recruiting targets. We're going to have to go back, ask for help to cover that end, partly because we have been paying for those pay raises already. There's a whole series of that. Both the Commandant and his Barracks 2030, the Chief of Naval Operations and her quality of service have a number of initiatives. We've increased sexual assault and prevention funding by 5 times in the last 3 years. We are putting money into mental health efforts, that taking care of people. We accelerated, with Congress's help, buying a berthing barge to make sure sailors who are in the yard while their ship is under construction or under maintenance have better places to live. So some of those are absolutely must funds. We're in a challenging recruiting environment, right? Incredibly low unemployment. For the budgeteer, that makes life easier because I just don't have as many people to pay. When those people sign up, we will pay for them, right? We will not neglect the sailors who are serving their country.
Any other questions here in the audience? I see one over here on this side of the room.
Hey, morning, sir. Nick Wilson, reporter with Inside Defense. Another question on the results of that 45-day review. So, I know it just came out, and so maybe the Navy's plans in terms of solutions are not fully fleshed out yet, but are there specific things that you're looking for from the shipbuilders themselves to kind of get after this problem more going forward? Thanks.
So there is no answer to your question right now on any particulars that are coming out of the 45-day review because we're still going through that. The second part of the question is it is a constant dialogue with the yards, right? The PEOs the program managers are constantly trying to have that conversation. And what we're trying to do is get the right incentives. We're having workforce challenges. That's absolutely true. Every single yard points to that problem. It's not too hard to figure out why. Unemployment is less than 4%. American workers have a lot of options of what they can go do. We are still not seeing the commitment to bringing those workers in and retaining them. How much do we need to adjust what we're doing for our contractors, for our industrial partners, to make sure that they take advantage of that? That is a conversation we need to have with them. Do we need to change? What do we need them to do differently? How do we work on that together? Just an example of things we'll have to explore.
Other questions here in the room? I've got one from online. Questioner says 2/3 of U.S. arms sales are via direct commercial sales, DCS. Does the absence of DCS info in procurement justification books create a blind spot for Congress and DoD itself on how these sales impact procurement programs?
No. We are absolutely looking at our suppliers and looking at what their load rate is. They want to have that conversation, and that information is transparent in reporting done through the Department of State and done through DSCA. It's just moving in a different channel than the budget book. So, having been a public defense budget analyst, I fully acknowledge the difficulty of going to reconcile those. But when you get the inside information, at the end of the day, while we want to be transparent with the American people and want Todd to have a great deal of raw material to do his work with, at the end of the day, if you're a key staffer on the Hill, we're going to show up and help you walk through that at every turn, right? We don't want you puzzling through and deciphering. We want to get the people who actually know into the room and help you with that. And we are always committed to that with our congressional overseers, just as we are inside the building.
All right, let me see if there are any other questions in here, or I've got one of my own. So we talked a bit about classified program lines, and I had been tracking for years this one called Link Plumeria, which had become quite large. In last year's budget request, it had an entry, a project within it called Next Generation FAXX, Next Gen Fighter. This year, of course, I go and I look at Link Plumeria, and that has now moved out, and the Next Gen Fighter for the Navy is now its own program element. But again, all the details are classified. Is there anything you can tell us about when we might know some of the details about that program? And does it have a name?
Well, I won't comment on the connection between Todd drawing between various programs, but we can talk about FAXX as the high-level program, the future fighter. I told Todd earlier I was going to answer most of his questions by invoking the hard choices necessary by the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Well, now he's come across one. All three of our major communities research programs, DDGX, SSNX, and FAXX, are delayed in the FY25 budget. That's a time slip for the two ships. For the aircraft, there's a significant investment that you can see in the public budget database that we think gets us to the next decision point. We are fully committed to those programs and have robust funding lines in them, but those are definitely development programs, and the rush to get them to sea is part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. That was a choice we were going to have to look at sometime soon. It absolutely was precipitated by the Fiscal Responsibility Act saying, well, I guess we're looking at that this year. So that is a conscious choice. It is a choice to make sure we balance the Department of the Navy portfolio across the globe and across time as well. Those next generation development programs don't even hit till later. It is the Virginia class right now. It is the Block 5. It is the DDG Flight 3 that are going to be the ones, not just this decade, but next decade, that are the mainstays of the Navy. So we recognize, in the President's word, the decisive decade. This moment is coming. This moment is here. You can't just always be thinking about the future. And that was a conscious choice in this budget and the clearest representation of hard choices being made because we're under caps.
Can you talk a little more about uncrewed systems in general that the Navy is pursuing, the uncrewed surface ships, uncrewed subs, uncrewed aircraft? I mean, you've got things like the MQ-25 tanker, takeoff of carriers, it's uncrewed. That's well underway. Can you talk about, what are those relative priorities and what are some of the hard choices you had to make in the uncrewed systems in this budget request?
Excuse me. I'm not sure we had to make too many hard choices about uncrewed, a little bit. Uncrewed is a very, very big word. Changes by domain. We're pretty confident in the air domain with a lot of uncrewed. MQ-25 is a very real program that has already been had a proof of concept. That is much more about getting the production out. It is not the uncrewed part that's hard. That's about building the airplane. To their credit, they're doing new approaches that should help us down the line, make every airplane less artisanal. One of the problems with the Navy aircraft we buy is they still have a lot of individualized rivets. The MQ-25 is an effort to get past that and use more modern manufacturing techniques. I'm very excited about it. You won't be surprised to hear that you're trying something new. It didn't go quite as smoothly as we hoped. The program office would tell you they're optimistic again. I'm the comptroller, so I get to reserve my judgment about that. But that's a different kind of question. Doing uncrewed on the surface and undersea are just different than doing it in the air, though. So some lessons you can take, some lessons you can't. If we had greater funds, you get to do more experimentation. You have to be less sure about what bets you're placing. That would be great. We absolutely are still committed to it. I've already talked about the Disruptive Capabilities Office. We've already talked about Replicator, and there's a number of named programs, both for uncrewed surface and uncrewed undersea, that we are still pursuing. So we have people playing with them. How do you actually use these? And we are pursuing technological solutions across the board.
All right. Question over here. Here it comes, right here.
Good morning. My name is Daniel Gagliano. I have a question going back to what you were talking about with supporting the industry side of things. Are you seeing differences between small shipyards and larger shipyards? And if so, how are those challenges being approached differently other than just throwing money at the situation?
Way to set me up great. I'm a little partial to my boss, the Secretary of the Navy, because he had a couple key budget jobs And so he understands the lingo I use, and so I'm always a little partial to briefing him. But one of his other canonical things is he himself, after he left service, was a small business owner, a successful small business owner. So at the general, before we even start talking about yards, he is fully committed to the industrial base in a very healthy way, right? Don't just go to the primes for an answer, and for a very healthy way. This isn't a make-work program. What we want to do is create a pipeline of industrial base. Find small businesses, grow them into medium businesses. Find medium businesses, grow them into large businesses. Let that wonders of market capitalism work so we can take advantage of initiative across the one. On yards, the Secretary has been very outgoing on this. First of all, he doesn't want to talk about just Navy shipbuilding. Under his initiative, Maritime Statecraft, he is very explicit to talk about United States shipbuilding. He wants everybody. Within the last 2 weeks, I was sitting in a meeting he convened where the administrator of the Maritime Administration was in there, where the Coast Guard acquisition person is sitting in there. I have a standing call with my Coast Guard counterpart just because my boss says, hey, we're going to do this collaboratively and cooperatively. You see that across the board. You see that in him visiting Korea and going to see what Korean shipyards are. We have to take that whole range of yards. We have to take folks who do cool yachts but can do some of our small boats and get them to have ever greater expanse. China has 45% of the world's shipbuilding. The PLA Navy doesn't cover the overhead. The PLA Navy is sitting there taking advantage. I don't think that's because of brilliant industrial-based policy. That's just scale, right? That's just a great thing. Whereas on the flip side, in the United States, our Navy yards do basically only Navy work, which means every bill or help they need comes directly from the Navy. If we could slip that, the Navy will get better results, and the entire United States will get better results. I absolutely think you're seeing some of these investments. I'm not sure I want to call them throw money at the problem. Budgeteers get nervous when you just start throwing money. But significant investments that we have not seen for many, many decades. And we're absolutely getting that support across the range because of this fundamental effort to make America competitive at every level.
I got a question from online here. It's about the Fiscal Responsibility Act, the budget caps that we're under. Given the spending caps put in place by the FRA, are you concerned about whether Congress will have the flexibility to provide money beyond the capped budget? We're calling it a supplemental, but money is money. Is a supplemental effectively a legal loophole in the FRA caps? Well, I mean, it's literally a legal loophole, right? To get it, you write in the language, this meets, and I'm not going to get it right. Luckily, you say it positively. This meets Section 231 or something of the Bipartisan Budget Enforcement, BBECA, right? So that language is in every single provision that goes into the supplemental. So you can absolutely do that. Do I think that is an intention to slip around the caps? No, not least of which because you only do it if you have the agreement from both houses of Congress and from the president, right? So that is the definition of a national decision. It was a national decision to go under the caps. It is a national decision to recognize there are some things like operations in the Red Sea, like support for Ukraine, that should not be bound by those caps. That's why it was built into the law in 1986 and has been used every time we have been under caps. We are very conscious. People in the building love to use the appropriators as boogeymen. I don't need the appropriators to be the boogeymen. I'm the one who's supposed to watch for the secretary, the CNO, and the commandant. Like, hey, are you spending your money on what you're supposed to? So I'm not looking for a slush fund. I'm looking for the right resources and that you can demonstrate you need those resources. Expending standard missiles makes it really easy to do counting. But even then, I've told you about our industrial base. Munitions are a big place we're working on with the industrial base. So just because we shut off a Tomahawk doesn't mean we can immediately put one on order. And we're working through that right now. In the FY25 budget, I've talked about all the investments into the shipyards, $277 million into the munitions manufacturers.
We got 6 out of our 7, that's we being DoD-wide, multi-year procurements, where we are consciously, I'm the budgeteer, multi-year procurements to lock that in, to take away the flexibility from my secretary, to take away the flexibility from Congress, to take away the flexibility from the president. I want something in return, and that better be very significant cost savings. 10 to 12% is the rough guideline. On munitions, we care so much about that strategic outcome. The admirals looked at what happened in Ukraine and said, we cannot have empty magazines. In the 24 budget, we increased our munitions account by 30%. Congress took some of that mark because they saw we had not successfully gotten the industrial lines up to speed. It is still very close to a 30% increase on what we had previously spent. And we have seen that same level in FY25. So under a cap budget, we said, these are must-haves. We have to keep investing in our munitions in the industrial base because we have to keep getting that. You're seeing with the Japanese who want to take on Tomahawks. Well, I don't want to say no to them. We want allies and partners to be out there on the fight with us. I want everybody to have as many Tomahawks as they can. We've put direct investments into solid rocket motors last year, both into some of our industrial partners and into Indian Head Warfare Center down the Potomac here to make sure that we have an ability to build some organic capability as well.
So, you know, a broad question here. What are your priorities in the 25 budget in terms of like getting it through, getting it on time, getting a 24 supplemental, you know, what are your priorities if you could tell Congress, you know, hey, this is what I really need you to work on for the sake of the Navy? What would your message be?
Without a doubt, the question is the FY24 supplemental. Now, to some extent, that's in a position of luxury. 3 weeks ago, I was anxious and nervous. We had a fully developed plan. My secretary, you can actually track it because my secretary published an op-ed in December saying, hey, if we have to live under this, this is what we're going to do. We're going to prioritize readiness, and we're going to prioritize our people. My team and the programmers did an amazing job actually building that into levers that we would actually pull. I'm really glad not to pull those. So thanks much for the base FY24. Now we need to talk about that FY24 supplemental. $3.3 billion submarine industrial base. There is up to $20 billion in reimbursement for Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan. There is direct, $6.5 billion direct funding to the Navy and Marine Corps that the Senate has already passed. So we're half a chamber away already. We already have half of Congress who's agreed to this. The president's already put it up. We also need help on the disaster supplementals. That is not currently, that was not in the Senate bill. The biggest place we see that is in Guam, which just suffered a typhoon at a time when this incredibly strategically important place is running into the executability problems of like, wait a minute, how do we do this? And then we lose ground to a natural disaster. That money, the big thing the Department of Defense has done this year is declared a senior defense official for Guam. That's one of my bosses, the Undersecretary of the Navy, with the specific task of, hey, this is strategically important, but we have to make it executable programs. It's an island. There is a limit. There are real constraints to getting stuff there, to getting people there to do the work. He's now got the task to make sure we marry those up. We can goose that if we get the supplemental that the president has requested through Congress this year. FY25, Todd, I'm not sure you're aware of this, but it's an election year. So my hopes of getting an appropriation in September, although if you'll forgive me, a budget joke, my standard of getting appropriations is never on time. My standard for getting the appropriations is did I get it before the next Congress? And that is a long-standing problem. Just to make sure we indulge in the geekiness, the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, Congress was having a hard time getting bills passed. So it said, well, maybe what they need is a little more time. Up until 1976, or up through 1975, the fiscal year ran July to July, and then Congress would appropriate it about 3 months late. So hey, wait a minute, if they just need more time, we move the appropriation, or we move the fiscal year to October 1st to September 30th, and oh, surprise, surprise, we started getting our bills around December. Unfortunately, we've now slipped into a new era when we get our bills in March. Well, that's not the same thing, and that's a like losing, it's not great to lose a quarter, but hey, I understand. Tough decisions are tough decisions. Now we're in a whole nother world. So do I have a lot of hope for FY25 being the year we get back on track? Not really, but I do hope we get to a more predictable and regular one. And again, I'm already conceding 2 months after the fiscal year.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm telling people my baseline expectation for FY25 is probably March of next year, unfortunately.
Oh, Todd, that's very negative.
I
very
know.
Negative.
Maybe I'm the pessimist, but it doesn't look good going into an election year. And once you punt past the election, then it's like, well, which party stands to gain more in the budget negotiations, and there's all kinds of incentives to push it into the new Congress, and then a new Congress comes in and they don't do anything in January, and they start thinking about it in February, and before you know it, it's March. So
to substantiate Todd's point here, Mike McCord, one of my other bosses, is the DoD comptroller. His favorite way to do it, which I already used, is the cumulative time we've spent under CR, so up to 5 years now. My way, which will illustrate Todd's point, is in the last 31 years, it's only been 7 times that we got the appropriations in the new Congress. That's not so bad. The only problem is, in the first 20 years of that period, it was once, and in the last 11 years, it was 7. That was terrifying to me to realize that we really might be in a new era. Hopefully that's over, and hopefully we now have greater predictability, although, yeah, I don't think it's going to be before a presidential election.
Yeah. Let's see if there are other questions here in the room from folks. So I've always got one that I always like to ask. If Congress just suddenly came to you and said, hey, we got some more money. We want to give it to the Navy. If you had $1 more, where would you put it in this budget?
Man, Todd, nobody ever asked me that question. I'm always the other one of like, nope, you can't have the marginal dollar. It's going here.
$1 more.
The secretary is very clear about one of the great things about working for the secretary. He's now the longest serving secretary since 2017. And the whole time he has had 3 enduring priorities. So we actually have it very clear. From the Marine side, they would immediately put the money to MILPERS. And make sure we're whole in that account, especially as they try to do recruiting. And they would also make sure force design and some of our aircraft programs, the clearest place you can see where we took our caps is just taking tails in the aircraft programs. So almost certainly that is the first dollar you see. Although I have to emphasize the service chiefs at least provide their version of what would they do with another marginal dollar. And what you see is what we've already talked about, right? The CNO's number one is, I need money for the submarine industrial base. I already worried she doesn't get a supplemental and already has asked for it. Well then, if you don't give it to me in the supplemental, I need it in an unfunded priority list. So we're already feeling that. We have some emerging things. She has a Hawaii water treatment. That is something that developed after the budget. So that's a execution flexibility thing, next marginal dollar. So we absolutely know where we would put it. And I'm going to cheat and be very Todd-like. The main thing that's clear is we're not buying our way out of these programmatic difficulties. $255 billion. As I like to point out to the admirals, 2 of the 3 best budget years of their career they have just lived through. We're not getting, we're buying 6 ships in the FY25 budget. 6. We get up to double digits by the end of the FIP. We think that's where we can stay. We think that's where we can get there, but 6 is not double digit. The number of money to take that 6 to double digit is, manna from heaven level money. We are making dramatic investments into the industrial base to try to prove, but that's single digit billions, right? To buy your way out of this problem is, I don't know, $2-3 trillion defense budget, and I'm a little bit worried we would lose a lot of it. So not to indulge in my inner budgeteer, but I am talking to you. The message I have for everybody is a marginal dollar absolutely helps on very specific things, MILPERS, taking care of people, Barracks 2030. A marginal dollar is not going to make the difference on our fundamental force structure. What we need to do is make sure we buy our things and buy them effectively.
So change the way you do business, all right? And then in the business world, there's also the option of change the business you're in. Do we need to be rethinking our approach to the industrial base or rethinking our approach to weapon systems, right? And, you know, turn away from maybe some of the large capital ships and really pivot into the uncrewed systems? I don't know. Like, are there options like that we should be weighing?
Oh, Todd. This is when maybe Todd has his conversion moment. So everybody who came, like, just see if I can get Todd to start writing different reports. So to answer his underlying question, I don't think there's a pivot here, right? We're buying uncrewed. We're doing all of the above. I won't be convinced, and we know we have to have those submarines, and we're seeing why we have destroyers in the Red Sea. So I don't think there's a fundamental shift we're going to do here. We do have $255 billion. But you also prefaced it with do things differently. And as the comptroller, the other hat I own is as the audit advocate. Todd and I have had a long relationship. We have been on mainly the strategic budgeting side, right? How money moves out of the Pentagon to Congress, what those big choices are. I was conversant enough in the audit terms to get the job. I can't believe how much of a believer in audit I have become. From the very basic thing of we do a bunch of business practices that we just haven't changed. One of our contract writing systems is called MOCAS. It's written in COBOL. It was first deployed in 1957. That's not great. I have a modern enterprise resource planning system, Navy ERP. We are currently migrating our last 3 commands, the 2 fleets, Fleet Forces and Pac Fleet, and Res 4. They are doing their data cleaning right now. I have a bunch of people, but all of my buying commands are already into Navy ERP, and yet I still have a bunch of contracts that are being written MOCAS, despite the fact that Navy ERP can handle them. Why are you using the COBOL system? Use the modern one. You use the modern one, I immediately get cyber protection. We have, it's called ICAM, identity credentialing. As long as you're in the modern system, that stuff's easy. And I get rigorous audit. You do it in the old systems, I do a bunch of hand jamming to try to make it match. That's not the magic of audit. The audit's not going to find that. What the audit does is point out we have a bunch of business processes we've been doing for a long time that aren't really getting the outcomes we want. Isn't the obvious answer change those business processes? I love the audit as a forcing function to start that conversation. I am super excited because we are just now coming in contact. We have now made enough progress that we are really coming in contact with the fleets, both migrating to the new systems, and right now we are talking to them about getting ordnance. You have to be careful with audit. I've learned DoD is a very accountable organization. 1957 is an incredibly early time to field a modern contract writing system. Like, that's a huge accomplishment. DoD should be proud of it. It's just that we did that and stayed in it, and everybody else kept moving along, and now we're lost. We are accountable. We don't lose things that go boom. So when I say ordnance, we don't lose that stuff. They are very diligent about it. But we don't do it in a way that achieves auditability, not least of which because we're very dependent on going and counting all of it, which we don't lose things that go boom. Lots of people count that stuff a lot. Not the same thing as being auditable. We're never going to give up readiness or mission to be auditable. I hope what I've illustrated is there's a huge amount of room to change how we're doing it, not in any way sacrifice mission or readiness, and still gain auditability. Oh, it's so embarrassing. My longest answer was about the audit. The Marine Corps just got the clean opinion, first military service to get it. And the most important thing was the cultural change within the uniforms. The commandant can speak financial management. The assistant commandant, who is coming out of the resourcing shop, can speak an accounting detail. And the beautiful part about that is they realized They're 4-star Marine generals. They're used to telling Lance Corporal, go do that. And Lance Corporals go do that, including putting their life at danger. Just because you can tell a Lance Corporal to go do it doesn't mean it's the most efficient or effective way to do something. With the audit, what they kept running into is, hey, you're failing at this because you're not doing what you said you would do. My IPAs, as long as you're within certain generally accepted standards, they're not telling you how to do it. They're just judging whether you're following your own policy. Why did you create this incredibly onerous policy that you're then failing at? How about you create a more reasonable policy that actually creates internal controls? You watch the Marine leadership go through that, learn that, and because of that, drive change in how the Marines did business that got them to a clean audit. I really believe all of DoD can do that. I'm very proud that in the Department of the Navy, we are doing that effort right now. Okay, so I hijacked Todd's question. I apologize.
No, that's great.
I think, so pretty soon Todd's going to start, forget those classified programs he wants to poke at that nobody's supposed to be telling him about. Audit, people should be telling you about, so I can't wait for your next audit report.
Well, it is something that comes up a lot with folks, even folks who aren't directly connected to the Pentagon. They hear the reports about DoD can't pass an audit. I think it is a great success, great credit that the Marine Corps has successfully passed an audit. What do you think the timeline is for the rest of the Navy?
2028.
2028?
All right, that's the number we say, and now that number is written into law, and we do have a plausible path to get there. What is scary right now is the problem we have had for many years, which you really saw since the kickoff in 2018, where we started doing annual audits, is we keep turning over rocks and finding things we didn't know about. We are absolutely still involved in that. So I have a plausible plan. It has cushion built in for turning over rock and be like, oh, crap, who knew that was going to be there? And like I said, we are now in contact with every part of the Navy, including those sailors who are going to report back to Fleet Forces when they come back from sailing around in the Red Sea. What we need is those Department of Defense-wide things. We are focused on 3 things right now within the Department of the Navy. The Department of the Navy is championing 3 things within the broader Department of Defense. The first one is government-furnished property. I have to have a good inventory, not just of my stuff, but of the stuff that's held by contractors. Some of that's little stuff. Some of that's, oh, by the way, here's your Sea Whip. We had a different contractor build it. Now you put it on a ship. Hey, please keep track of this multi-$100 million thing. Again, they're not losing it. And my favorite joke is they're all audited. They all have clean opinions. And their independent auditors aren't walking through the yard and be like, hey, what's that major box over there? How come that's not on the list? They're auditable. We, the Department of Defense, failed to say, hey, it's important to us that you tell us where things are so we can be audited. I am confident this is absolutely an example of partnership. If we, the Department of Defense, say, no, we care about this, my secretary signed out letters to some of the biggest primes, and they have all responded very positively. My team has had a conversation last week and has another conversation this week to get at that. It's a great way where it's not the Navy. I need industrial partners to help, but I think they will. The second one, what the Marines ran into is a huge amount of unmanned transactions. If you buy something from what's called a working capital fund, a business-like entity, they tell you the price. But when it shows up, they charge you whatever price it is now. Can you imagine Amazon doing that to you? The price changes for Amazon too, and every once in a while they're like, hey, that changed too much, we cannot do it, and they'll cancel on you, right? Frankly, that's a perfectly fine way to do it within government, because the money didn't leave the US government until here. What it is really hard on is all my financial systems, which has one number here and one number there, and one of the ways you match to make sure these transactions are the same things are on their price, except they're not the same. So we're advocating for changing that department-wide. We just got permission. There are downsides, and this is a classic audit problem. Financial systems, or financial management, all upside. My sustainment logistics community, they have to do things differently. They have to change. They have to make investments. You can see why they're like, wait a minute, why am I doing that? That's why the audit can't just be a financial management. We'll get there. I think you change those business management practices, you will improve readiness, you will improve parts availability, you will improve visibility on parts, you will improve time parts get to you. I still have plenty of operators who are like, why are we doing this stupid audit thing? When I do that with the supply chain within the Department of Defense, they're like, well, If we save 5 minutes at every stop on that part, does that get to operationally relevant timelines to you? And they're like, yes, yes it does. And they become fans too.
All right. Well, we are out of time.
Oh man.
We could go
Can't believe I
another hour.
filibustered on the audit.
Go another hour on the audit, but unfortunately we're out of time for today. Please join me in thanking Russ Rumbaugh for joining us here for a great discussion. Thank you.